Welcome to Catholic Breakfast. We're taking a look at Saint Augustine's Confessions, doing a deep dive into that amazing text. Today we're going to look at book 4 of Saint Augustine's Confessions. It's really worth taking a look at because of the way Augustine is struggling with losing someone he loves and how he discovers in that God in a new way. So book 4 of Augustine's Confessions is really, in some ways, an interesting time in his life because he's now a full-grown adult in the story of his life. He's teaching, his career's taken off, he's far from home, and things seem like they're going pretty well for him until he loses a dear friend. And much of this chapter is him struggling with the loss of this friend. A little background, in the ancient world, there was a particular high valuing of friendship. I saw a statistic the other day that said something like 50% of American males over the age of 35 have like no other male friends. So in our culture, we don't value friendship. Not so in the ancient world. And Augustine had this childhood friend who came to the city where he was teaching, and they struck up their friendship. Read the book for the details, but eventually his friend dies. And Augustine is uniquely devastated. Anyone who's lost someone that you love in a deep way perhaps can relate with what Augustine is going through. Augustine in chapter 6 of book 4 describes it this way. He says, "In me there was a kind of odd feeling." This is quite some time after his friend had died. He says, "I was at once utterly weary of life and in great fear of death." So he feels like death is pressing in on him, and he's terrified of it, but he's so exhausted of living. He says, "It may be that the more I loved him, the more I hated and feared as the cruelest enemy that death which had taken him from me. And I was filled with the thought that it might snatch away any man as suddenly as it had snatched him." That leads Augustine just a few chapters later, it's chapter 8, when he realizes not only is my soul kind of torn in half, losing this friend of mine. Like we were like one soul in two bodies, and when he died, something in me died. Then as time goes by, he starts to think, well, maybe I could, strike up friendship and a love that would make my life worth living. But here's what he says in chapter 8. Time takes no holiday. He realizes as he looks out at the trajectory of time, there's a huge problem, and we all feel it. He says this: "The place of that great grief was slowly taken, not perhaps by new griefs." So he's meeting other people, and he's getting new friends, and life's moving on. But he says, "but by the seeds from which new griefs should spring." In other words, Augustine realizes with this kind of morbid shock, everything is going to die. Every person I love, every person that I attach my heart to, that I cleave to, is going to die. It puts him in a terrible, it's like an existential crisis of the first degree. And Augustine has had the courage to admit it. This is a major problem. So most of us, if we haven't lost someone that we love deeply, we sort of dance around our life like that's not a problem, And we just, well, everything's fine, Is it? Talk to any person who's married and ask them about the death of their spouse, of his or her spouse. And you're dealing with a problem of the most fundamental order in this life. And that's what Augustine is up against. Now, if you want to see how he starts to craft an answer in his experience, go to chapter 9 of book 4. Here's the problem. He says, "This is the root of our grief when a friend dies, and the blackness of our sorrow, and the steeping of the heart in tears for the joy that is turned to bitterness, and the feeling as though we were dead because he is dead." And that's the problem, right? Now he starts to moving a little bit into a path forward. He says, "Blessed is the man that loves thee, O God, and his friend in thee, and his enemy for thee. For he alone loses no one that is dear to him, if all are dear in God, who is never lost." Now, that maybe sounds like semantics or something, or some little religious platitude. It's anything but. The key there is the expression "in God." He realizes a man is so blessed, not if he doesn't love people around him and loves God only. That's not what Augustine's saying. He's saying a man is blessed if he loves people around him in God, loves his spouse, loves his children, loves his friends in God. Why? Because God is never lost. It's so good, isn't it? So in chapter 10, Augustine's going to go further in this. He's going to say, "You, O God, are creator of all things, but let it not cleave too close in love to them through the senses of the body." In other words, save the deepest love, my most fundamental love, for God. He's gonna really give the answer in an even clearer way in chapter 11. Be not foolish, my soul, nor let the ear of your heart be deafened with the clamor of your folly. Listen, he says. The word himself calls you to return. If you want to see maybe Augustine's great sort of exclamation point on how to love things in God and why that makes sense, go to the very end of book 4. We have no fear that there should be no place of return, merely because by our own act we fell from it. Our absence does not cause our home to fall, which is thy eternity. So in other words, not only do I not fear the death of my loved ones, I don't even fear my own death. That's what Augustine's saying. Why? Because the absence of a loved one when they die, or my absence, it doesn't cause our home to fall, because what's finally the home of the human person? It's God, who is eternity itself. One example I can think of this in my own life, just recently at St. Thomas Aquinas Parish, where I am, we had a tragic death of a young husband. Being at the funeral, it was just deeply sorrowful stuff, but his wife, a wonderful woman, was carrying her sorrow through the funeral in this particular way, and I think a lot of people noticed it. And after the funeral, I was speaking with one of the other priests at the funeral, and he said something to this effect. He said, she seemed heartbroken, but not destroyed by grief. And I thought, that's exactly right. She's grieving the loss of her best friend, her husband, taken from her much too soon. And yet she's loving him in God. She's going to miss him terribly. Of course she will. She's feeling, of course, the burden of her life without her husband. And yet she's not destroyed by it, because she's loved her husband in God, and God is not destroyed. And that's why, think of the Catholic funeral mass. We entrust a person into God's loving heart and loving hands, where we hope to see him again in eternity. That's what Augustine's talking about. Where the experience of loving someone in God doesn't take away the psychological pain of death, of our death, of the death of people we love. It gives us a home, a place of repose, so that we can be generous with our love. We don't have to hold back our love, but finally we cleave to God above and below and through all things, and we love everyone whom we love in God. That's the grace that Augustine is starting to discover in Book 4. So anyway, check out our Facebook group for this deep dive into Confessions by Augustine. It's Catholic Breakfast, Confessions over Coffee. Sign up for the group. Love to have you.